Jada, it's your first film, so I'm going to make you be the first speaker. I'm curious where you got the idea to make this film about cats, kind of through the cat's level view of the universe, and how you undertook it, how you executed this plan. Isn't there a phrase in the movie business, don't ever work with children or animals?
Yes, there is, for good reason. But in our case, we weren't trying to get them to stick to a script, so it was a completely different experience. I grew up with street cats in Istanbul till I was about 11, and when we left the country to live in other parts of the world, they were the ones that I missed the most, and when we went back, they were the one constant in this very changing city. And so I always had it in my mind to do something with them. I just didn't know what it would be. At the beginning, I thought maybe I could do a straight-up nature documentary, maybe a March of the Penguins with cats, or something that's just set in an urban environment and forget about the people. But then, as I was talking to the people about the cats, and they would reveal these sort of more poetic and philosophical takes on life, I realized that they could be the voice that I needed to have in the film. But I still don't feature them in any special way. You don't know who anybody is, but their words about their reflections on the cats are what's important. So it just kind of grew out of my love for them and like my studying anthropology. The thing that struck me the most about human beings is how we chose to settle down and say, this piece of land is my land and I'm going to fight over it and, grow things on it. And the interesting thing to me was that cats were there with us at that kind of moment when we made that decision. And it's not part of the film because there was no scientific evidence of it at the time, but now there is, which was really exciting. But so these cats have been with us for a very, very long time in this sort of imposed domestication that we have done for ourselves and they have done for themselves. So it's very interesting how out of the two species on the planet that we have this very interesting relationship.
There's no cats flushing any toilets in this film, though.
There's absolutely no cats doing anything for our entertainment. It's on the contrary, the humans are doing things for our entertainment. And it was very important to me that I filmed the cats as if I was filming human subjects. And so that's how I wanted to come across.
So, Errol, in this conversation about style, I earlier talked about the way in which observational cinema, so-called cinema verite, which I think is a term no one really wants to apply to their film, but seemed to stick for a long time and still today. But with such a dominant style...
I'll apply it to my films.
Cinema verite, you're happy to apply cinema verite to yours?
Why not?
Okay. Yeah, we're good. You can hear Errol, right? Yeah. Well, whatever that style was known as before, when you came along with films like Gates of Heaven and Vernon, Florida, and Thin Blue Line, you were doing something different, and you're continuing to do something different now with your film Wormwood that's going to show tonight. Can you talk about when you were starting out making your first films, what you were setting out to do with the style of how you told stories?
Fuck with it. I knew there were all of these documentary rules. I didn't come out of direct cinema. Not at all. I started watching films at the Pacific Film Archive, and the documentaries that I remember early on, there were Herzog's documentaries, and there was a documentary element really in all of Herzog's films. Agira is really a documentary of what happens if you take Klaus Kinski to the Amazon and put him in a conquistador suit and make a film about it. Properly considered, they're all documentaries. And I would see various films that really were contrary to what most people nowadays think of as documentary. Whether it was various French documentarians, I remember the Vigo film Apropos to Nice. Things that were somewhere between art films and something else, I'm not sure. And since documentaries cost, or at least they did in those days, so much less than regular movies, Roger Ebert asked me if I could define for him the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And I told him that's pretty easy, 2 zeros. Why not experiment with the form? One of the things that interests me about your films is that you indeed have experimented with the form from the very beginning and created new and different kinds of things that are interesting and unexpected. And isn't that what you want to do? So, style, the whole issue of style, or maybe I should let Brett speak because I've been babbling away here too long.
Well, Brett, how did you come to think about style in your films? As I should say, the most recent episode of my podcast, Pure Nonfiction, has a conversation I did with Brett at the Toronto Film Festival about his film Jane, although it weaves into lots of his films. I also have a conversation with Errol from over the summer talking about the B-side. Brett, in our conversation, I talked about the way in which each of your films has a different style. In Chicago 10, you're using animation. In The Kid Stays in the Picture, you're using kind of photo animation, and so on. And in Jane, you're really drawing on this incredible archival work.
Well, in terms of choosing the style for the films, I always start from a very simple premise, which is how do you describe the subject? And if you can write down a list of adjectives or sometimes verbs or nouns to describe the subject, that then becomes the style of the film. And so the films become a reflection and they bounce back and forth. The way that I approach it, the way I got into this was similar to Errol, which was not through traditional documentary stuff. I love cinema. I couldn't speak until I was 5 years old. I had a terrible speech impediment and was in therapy until I was 16. But the movies were the most constant thing in my life. And
why did you end it then?
It's like Caspar Hauser. To this day, I can't even walk into a theater without getting popcorn. Like, I had to bring popcorn in there. So I just like movies. And then I got very lucky and almost spoiled in that when I was a very young age, I got turned on to the French New Wave by a teacher at AFI named Jim Hosny. This is in like 7th grade. And when you're in 7th and 8th grade and you love cinema and you get exposed to the French New Wave, it's like mind-blowing because you suddenly realize film can be anything. And so I was going to try to become like a young French New Wave filmmaker, and I went to Hampshire College and I took a survey course on the history of documentary film, going from Lumiere and Flaherty up to Ross McAway, and past Errol and through Errol's work, and we had a very traditional professor named Len Glick, and I remember I saw this short film called the Newer, by I believe a ballerina / cinematographer named Hilary Harris, if I'm not mistaken, and it was a montage of this tribe in Africa, and it was asynchronous. And I remember thinking that I had such a better sense of who these people were through that montage than through any of the quote-unquote objective documentary approaches. And so that became a huge turn-on, which was this idea that you can use the language of cinema in the texture of it to tell your story. Anyways, and then so then I just decided I was going to make nonfiction films and take everything I know that I loved about cinema and try to make nonfiction films for the cinema. When I got into it, Errol was the only one doing really that seemed dedicated to creating nonfiction films for a cinema. And in a time, you said something to me the other day about watching Giant on your phone, the difference between. But to me, there is a big definition between cinema and the other mediums, which is the sound and working the room and working. There's so much more available, I feel, working in theatrical nonfiction, and specific to sound, which doesn't exist on the phone per
I
se.
haven't seen Jane yet, my apologies, but I can tell just from looking at the trailer that you worked out on sound design that became a major element in the film. And that is something, well, that anybody who is interested in putting their film in theaters obsesses over.
Well, I even pull it out when it's going to television. Like, we literally strip 70% of the sound out because it just muddies up the frequencies when it gets to, I think like sound for television is more like a haiku. You know, where you get like vocals, dialogue, and one effect or something.
Let me ask you about the tools that each of you use in telling your stories. Did you want to finish something?
I just want to say, I just have to say this, and I think I speak on behalf of all of us, that Errol, the thing that has amazed me about your career, and I think is the greatest source of inspiration of everything you've done, is that I've always felt that the thing you described, that each film you were challenging the existing notions of nonfiction to the point that you didn't settle on a style, that the difference between Gates of Heaven and Brief History of Time, and then when Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control came, it was like a complete another turn. And that sort of a sense of adventure, you know, and I like to say that like most people can only dream of reinventing cinema, like if ever once, and like I feel like in many ways you've reinvented the language several times, which it doesn't even exist. There is no counterpart in the realm of fiction.
Gee whiz.
But no, I mean,
Thank you.
you're. When we talk about style and documentary, I mean, the conversation kind of begins with Errol, and it's sort of, I don't know where it goes from there. It's sort of.
I
Anyway.
remember thinking at the time I made my first film, Gates of Heaven, you had these documentary rules. The rule was that you should use available light. The camera should be handheld. It should not be on a tripod. You shouldn't move anything, God forbid. You should film things as they are, or such as they are, or how you imagine they are. And on. There were these documentary rules. And so I set about making a film that broke every single one of them. The character in Vernon, Florida, my second film, once said to me, "You know, Errol, you don't break the rules break you." And I've thought about that often over the years. I think he's right. But
Jada, in your film,
notwithstanding,
Jada, were you following rules in how you approach these cats?
No, not at all. But I was in the opposite spectrum, end of the spectrum to you guys. I had nothing to prove. I mean, I had everything to prove, but also no name to defend. Nobody knew me. I had been only in narrative stuff and only as, you know, short form and or as producing. And so this was my opportunity to just throw everything out the window. And you know, I find it interesting that you say there used to be rules. I feel like there's still all these rules about documentary formats and how you have to have a certain amount of conflict in every scene. And, you know, it can't just be, it can't possibly ever be a feel-good movie. You know, it has to be these like sort of heavy, you know, guidelines and or more cerebral maybe rather than emotional and visual. And the only people who seem to be able to get away with it are people like yourselves who already have a name for them. So for me, it was like I just went into it thinking, we'll keep the budget as low as possible. We'll convince our investors that they'll never get their money back, and we'll just do what we can.
Oops, you failed.
We failed. Now they think they'll make money with every film that they invest in, which is scary.
That'll work for at least one more film.
Hopefully. But, you know, it's so interesting. You know, you're even making an animal the subject of a documentary. It's not a new concept by any means, but forcing a narrative onto the footage you're getting of those animals is what I tried to go against, you know, because we already have sort of set beliefs about every other species on the planet, or even each other. So to be able to sort of throw everything out the window and change people's perception of another species, of another group of people, of another gender, of another religion, was all I could, attempt to do. And so I just tried to be as honest and authentic about it as possible. So I tried to have the perspective of my 8-year-old self when I used to follow these cats around, or my casual version that I talk to anybody and I get to know them and I want to know what their day is like. And so I wanted to just get to the bottom of that. And it was stylistically, it ended up requiring us to, figure out how to be as close to the ground as possible without actually, breaking our backs or getting too dirty and getting weird attention from people. So my cinematographer and producing partner, Charlie, devised a camera, a rig that was basically, that allowed our cameras to be at ankle height. And he's like, he also comes from a narrative background, and his references are like the third man. So we're making a cat documentary in Istanbul with the third man as our reference for visuals. So that's why you get this film, I think, that you get.
Well, I'm very interested in the tools that filmmakers invent to tell their stories. Errol, one of your tools was the Interatron. In fact, a friend of mine who used to work for your old law firm said when the law firm went out of business, they were getting rid of files, and he inherited the files of your paperwork applying for a patent for the Interatron. Did you ever get that patent?
No. I've often had the fantasy that I'm in some substandard nursing home, and there are Interatrons everywhere. Many people have become fabulously rich, but I'm strapped to a mattress soaked with my own urine. Indigent at best. It hasn't quite happened yet, but I somehow still see it in my future. This is a cautionary tale for all of you out there who might seek a patent. Seriously. I had made a film about Stephen Hawking, Brief History of Time, and the New York Times had run an article about the movie called Interviewing the Universe, written by Philip Gurevich, who subsequently became a collaborator and friend of mine. And there was a 2-page spread of me interviewing people, actually, as it turns out, for Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control. The gardener in Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, the topiary gardener. And underneath that picture, it said Errol Morris with his interviewing device, the Interatron. So here's what all of you, see, I'm shaking my finger at you, you should remember. You have 1 year from the first public announcement of your invention until you can patent it. And during that year, you can patent it. After that, you're out of luck. And I didn't try to patent it until about a year after that article ran in the New York Times. So there you go.
Lessons taught.
I was fucked.
Brett, I want to ask about one of your most stylistically distinct films, The Kid Stays in the Picture, that you made with Nanette Burstein. That film, anyone who saw it at the time couldn't help but notice what you were doing with a photo animation technique, taking still photos, making them move and look like a 3D practice. Since then, that film, that technique has been used in lots of other films, and it's interesting to reflect on, techniques that start out new and then become commonplace. Can you talk about, how your team, came upon that technique and got it into the film?
Yeah, I haven't used it since. And maybe the story will articulate why. The Kid Stays in the Picture talked about a movie that's about documentary film. That movie was entirely designed as that class I took in Hampshire College. My response to that was the kid stays in the picture, opening up a movie with their 3 sides to every story, your side, my side, and the truth, and no one is lying. And underneath that, you hear the sound of an orchestra tuning up. And there's red curtains, like you're in a theater, and the curtains open up, and you're in someone's backyard. So I'm trying to suggest that his whole reality is this artifice, right? And everything with Bob is about perception and illusion and what have you. And so the idea of, and he's such a great storyteller, we weren't fact-checking anything, right? So the idea of distorting those pictures was both served 2 purposes. One, to on a surface level, it's about image and image making, and on a second level was distorting the image to create a covenant with the viewer that we're not necessarily entirely buying everything he's saying. It's a great yarn, and we're going to go with it. And then, like I said, it's stylistically seducing you at the same time. So it's doing what Bob does, right? So again, everything stems from some sort of underlining reason. It's not style for style's sake, but style that serves a function that was in harmony with the narrative of the film, which was the storyline of that film was about a man who got everything in life because of his image. When that image became tarnished, had nothing left until he got his name back in Variety, and then he got everything back again.
By the way, in addition to this technique that you're talking about, Kid Stays in the Picture, for me, did a lot of really novel things, that being one of them. I think the entire use of graphics is kind of amazing, and represented a different way, a more complex way of using photographs, type on the screen. I think, once again, a really innovative, important documentary just for style alone.
Thanks, Harold.
And I even liked it.
The thing before that, I think, with still photographs, with ephemera and newspapers, is just by virtue of how they existed on photo animation stands, there was a limitation to what we can do with them. And what I felt with the Kid Stays in the Pictures, I use this analogy that ephemera and photo animation, it's like walking onto a soundstage and there's a house, but the house hasn't been lit and you haven't decided where the camera's going to go. So you can make that house into a Norman Rockwell, bright light, It's Morning in America, or you can turn it into a haunted house, all depending on how it's lit and where the camera goes. And it's the same thing with ephemera, with a newspaper article. You could take a newspaper article and it could be filled with this so much emotional warmth, right? And then, or it could become completely distressed and Xeroxed 100 times over, but it has to have a purpose. Like, so it's not the same. When I hear sometimes filmmakers taking all their photographs and sending off to the animator, like some factory, like I'm just going to send this. It blows my mind because it's like how that stuff gets integrated back into your film. It's as if it's B-roll. Like I know movies called B-side. I hate this word B-roll.
I hate it too.
Yeah, because it's all A-roll. There's no such thing as B-roll.
That's correct.
Jada, getting back to the tools that you were creating to film with the cats.
I say that all the time.
Can you give us more detail about how you were getting down to cat level?
We had elaborate, by elaborate I mean at the hobby shops, the most elaborate remote-controlled pickup trucks we could find, and then we stripped them and outfitted them with the lighter, best kind of image-stabilized cameras that we could find, which was a brilliant idea, but in application, the cats absolutely hated it, and so we barely got to use it. And then we had tailor-made vests.
You might want to patent it.
I might
This could be
need
the
to
first time
patent it.
it's being made public.
No, the cat cam rig, yes, you're right.
Right now.
All of this I have to patent.
The clock is ticking.
I got
November
it here.
10th.
You said the cats hated it.
Yeah, they hated the noise of the little engine, and they hated it was just like a little inanimate thing running around. So they either attacked it or they ran away from it. Very rarely did they attempt anything else. But it was very clear early on that they only approved of the camera if we were attached to it, rather than if it was just like this thing of its own. And we tried to put vests on them with tiny cameras, which you can put the vests on them, but then they just sit there and they're like, I'm not moving. And then you realize halfway through that if they do move and disappear, that you're never getting the camera back. So it failed. And so in the end, the best way was that we were actually literally physically on the floor or with this cat cam that we created, which allowed us to pull focus from the handle and still have the camera at ankle height. And then that way we could get all those tracking shots, over the shoulder tracking shots of the cats. And we were two cameras at all times. So, and it was like an elaborate dance that Charlie and our local Turkish cinematographer would do, where one would pick the wide lens and one would pick the long lens in the morning, and then they would just kind of dance around each other trying to get the continuous shot.
Here's something that I find so cruel about stylistic innovation is that you've created your own style for Kedi, and if you went and made another film about dogs in Budapest, people would say,
Wait a second, I'm making that film.
Okay.
Damn, should have patented it.
People would say, Jada's repeating herself. The more bold you are with the style, the more you can feel trapped by reputation by it. Now, other people can go off and make films in your styles, as people have made films in your style, Errol. But if you made another film with an Interrotron, you'd be at risk of people saying, "Oh, well, Errol is repeating himself." In the B-side, you got rid of the Interrotron. I asked you about that, and you said you got sick of it.
Yeah. Even though I believe lack of variety is the spice of life, occasionally I do like to change things up. Enough is enough.
Did you feel like telling this?
You started experimenting that, if I'm not correct, not to sound like too big of a fan, but in some of your bank commercials, you started to play off-axis, if I'm not mistaken. You were doing Interrotron and using an off-axis camera, right?
Yes.
So were you using sort of commercials to experiment for work to try out ideas that you would later try in your feature ideas?
Well, I use commercials for everything, including income. So the answer is yes. But commercials properly considered is just filmmaking. Filmmaking under perhaps trying circumstances, but filmmaking nonetheless.
What was that commercial? Because you know what I'm talking about? And it had this. It was like short-sighted. It was there was one camera direct to camera, and then there was the second. It was not Bank of. I don't think it was Bank of America. And then you were using your second key. Where you just like a two-camera setup, and the second camera was sort of short-sighted off-axis.
I can't.
Sorry.
I don't want to be difficult, but I've done over 1,000 commercials. It's all. One of the first commercials I did, and I'll stop quickly. My cameraman, who I was working with for the first time, I ended up doing hundreds and hundreds of commercials with him.
Bob?
No, it's Peter Donahue. And I asked Peter, he had just come off a commercial, what commercial were you doing? And he looked at me, a long pause, and he said, I don't know. I said, what do you mean, I don't know? He said, I just don't know. I don't remember. And I thought, how is this possible? How is this possible that you could make a whole series of commercials and not remember anything about it? Now I know.
What was the last commercial you worked on?
See, now you're going to embarrass me in front of everybody. I just did a series of commercials for IBM.
See, so you remember, so you're still in it.
I do, I'm sorry.
I want to talk about music as a big part.
And I did use the Interrotron and an off-axis camera. So there.
I want to talk about music as a big part of the filmmaker's toolkit. Jada, how is your approach to music in Kedi?
I'm sick of seeing footage of Istanbul or Turkey accompanied by this like exotic kind of music, which doesn't mean anything. And
Can you do another demonstration of that?
please no. That goes to show I'm not a music person. I worked with a composer who was classically trained. She had no film scoring experience whatsoever, but she had been trained with Steve Reich and John Adams, and she had the sensibility of using, percussion. And the whole score is basically mostly percussion, and it's the chimey sort of percussion actually ends up capturing that sort of timeless and feline feeling of cats, light-footed feeling. And then the music, the rest of the music in the film is actually from Turkish musicians from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s who were inspired by Western trends, and Western musicians who were inspired by Turkish music. So it kind of gives you this little, both it's a little nostalgic for like Turks who see it, because, my film, like, I didn't even think that we would be so successful in the U.S. Like, I was making it for, the first audience were Turks, Istanbulites, and then Europeans, and then the U.S. And
Humans, not cats.
Cats. Obviously, you hope it'll be a global thing, and everybody in the world can see it. So you try to keep that in mind when you're crafting the film. But I had to add layers. I wanted to add layers of the film, and through music, that was one of the ways I could do it. So if you're 40, 50, 60, 80, it doesn't matter if you're from Turkey. One of those pieces of music means something to you, and if you're not, they sound strangely familiar. You don't understand the lyrics, but you understand the melodies. So it kind of reinforces this idea that Istanbul is an accessible place, that has been a place where a lot of people have been through and settled, and it is really truly East meets West in that sense.
Errol, when you talked about throwing out the rules of cinema verite, one of those rules had been to not really use music in your film the way fiction filmmakers do, especially in Thin Blue Line and the score by Philip Glass. The music was front and center in that film, and you've had relationships with a lot of different composers. Can you tell me what that conversation is like with a composer?
Well, it certainly depends on which composer. There's a line I like very much from Philip Glass. I'm always thinking about it. He said they can always copy what you've done, but they can never copy what you're going to do. And I like that sentiment. The Thin Blue Line was the first movie where I'd actually used a lot of music. I don't know why that is. I'd made 2 films prior to that with hardly any music in them at all. And I'm a musician. Maybe that makes it odder. I don't know. And we were using scratch music. When you're editing, often you don't have a final score for a movie, so you'll dig up CDs, whatever, and put scratch music against picture to try to figure out what's going to work and what isn't going to work. And we were editing the Thin Blue Line with Philip Glass scratch music. A lot of it. Twyla Tharp in the upper room, facades, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it works so well that I thought, oh, I'm going to have to get someone who can write music like Philip Glass. It took a long time to get him to agree to do it. It took a long time to get him to even look at a rough cut. When he looked at the rough cut, he immediately agreed to do it. And that was just the beginning of enormous difficulty. He wrote a lot of music that didn't quite work. I didn't know you were allowed to ask him to change the score. There's a Gabriel Marquez line also that I have loved over the years. The first time he read Kafka's Metamorphosis, he thought to himself, I didn't know you were allowed to do that. So it gave him license to do things that perhaps would have been otherwise unimaginable. I shifted all the music around, additional cues were written. I work with Philip at the piano on many of the cues. I remember telling him at one point, you know, the trouble with this music, Philip, is it's just not repetitive enough.
He'd never heard that in his career before.
He gave me this odd look and said, that's a new one. But I think that he created one of the best scores ever for a motion picture, and for that I am deeply grateful. So thank you, Philip.
I have to say, well, Brett is probably laughing extra hard because he just worked with Philip Glass on Jane. And Brett told me a story that Philip Glass said about working with Errol. But Errol, you're going to have to listen to the podcast to hear.
The other side of that story.
Really? I hope he was nice.
Brett, do you want to?
Oh, yeah. No, he told me that, he said that you reject almost everything. But he said he was secretly convinced that you do it so you can get a stash of temp tracks to use for other stuff.
Well, this is interesting. The only problem with this interpretation is that he owned all the music. And in fact, he was left with a stash of music which he could resell to others. He often told me how profitable it was for him to work on the Thin Blue Line because so much music had been created and he was able to use all of it. Anyway, he's a fabulous, I'm not just saying this, it's just simply a statement of fact. He's a fabulous collaborator. He's collaborated with Brett. He's collaborated with so many, many, many people over the years. Filmmakers, playwrights, choreographers. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And he is one of our truly great talents.
I want to ask about stylistic choices that you make, that when you do something deliberate in an interview, in the way you film a character, in a recreation, to get closer to the truth of a situation. Brett, in your film Jane, you're interviewing Jane Goodall, and one might think that you just happened upon her in her office and set up the camera and started interviewing. But there was a lot more intentionality behind that. Can you describe that?
Yeah. I had never done an interview for a documentary until Montage of Heck. And
A film about Kurt Cobain.
A film about Kurt Cobain. Probably in some respects because I never thought of a good way to use interviews in a documentary, and feeling that everything has to have some sort of purpose. When I went to do Montage, I was really influenced by the film Lenny. You guys know the film Lenny? The Bob Fosse film?
Sure.
The interviews in the film Lenny are my favorite interviews of any documentary, even though it's not a documentary. But if you remember the interviews in the film Lenny, it's three characters. It's the manager, the wife, and the manager, the girlfriend, and the mom. And they're all shot to look like they're happening from the middle of the day deep into the evening. And it's fiction, so they can cheat it. But that was sort of my impetus for when I did Montage of Heck, is I wanted to all the interviews to unfold so that in the context of the movie, the first interview you came to would be Morning Light in America, and the last interviews would be deep into the depths of night with Courtney and the darkest, most the deepest, most despairing part of the films, and so we sort of did, so it's, and then for the locations, we sort of designed all the locations, so nobody was at their like house. We just, sometimes because like Kurt's dad was coming down to do the interview, and so I just was like, oh, I wonder what Kurt's dad's house would look like. So I went to Burbank, because it just, if you grew up in LA, there's sort of wood paneling in Burbank, and sort of designed everything, which I think was heavily influenced by Brief History of Time, which I remember seeing the making of Brief History of Time and how you build sets for everything. And the beautiful aspect of that is now you can control the lighting. And now the lighting can be reflective of what the person is saying. Isn't that an amazing idea? I mean, talk about borrowing stuff from fiction. Why do we not light our interviews to reflect what someone's saying? Or put the angle, the camera, where it should be for that moment. So like Kurt's mom, if you remember Montage, the last time we see her, we short side her, right? So we cross axis on her, we short side her, she's completely in the shadows, right? And so it takes a little control and restraint, because earlier in the interview when she has the wrong light and she starts talking about something that needs to be in nighttime light, you have to stop the interview. You go, I'm so sorry, we're not set up for that. We'll come back to that. But it seems to me that every decision one makes that we can, as directors, should be a reflection of what we're trying to convey. So with Jane, Jane was very much the same thing. We wanted to do the day to night thing again, and when Jane didn't want to travel much from our house, so we went to our home in Dar es Salaam, and we found a room that was not being used, and we spent a week building it out to look like Gombe. And then what was intense was, as we were rolling, her grandson came in and said, this was Hugo's room before he died. Hugo's Jane's husband, and he got very sick at the end of his life, and this was the room that he basically died in, and this was what we were doing the interview about him, which was quite interesting. But Jane loved how we designed it so much, she apparently kept everything exactly as is. But yeah.
So, Errol, in talking about finding new techniques to tell stories in your new film Wormwood, that's going to play at 6 o'clock today, you're pushing the recreations that you started in Thin Blue Line further with actors in speaking roles, creating dialogue approximating what you think took place.
The dialogue approximates nothing. I made it up. We lack even an effective vocabulary to talk about this stuff. That's part of the problem. I see people straining to come up with some kind of terminology. Reenactment, a term which I despise. I had to deal with this at the time of the Thin Blue Line. The Academy refused even to consider the Thin Blue Line for an Oscar because it had reenactments in it. People who were there at the screening said they turned it off after 10 minutes, horrified. The Philip Glass music, the reenactments, tell him to go fuck himself. And I got, of course, well, I'm defensive anyway, but I got even more defensive. And I would say, what exactly am I reenacting here? The reenactments in the Thin Blue Line were reenactments of untruth, of things that it was clear did not happen. What exactly is being reenacted anyway? And my final, I thought this was pretty clever on my part, but maybe it's not so clever. Most of the things I think are pretty clever are pretty stupid. I would go around saying, after all, everything is a reenactment consciousness is a reenactment of reality inside of our pathetic little skulls. I might even stick with that. When you're a detective, and I was a private detective for many years, I still am. I think once a detective, always a detective of some sort. What are you doing? You're putting together bits and pieces of reality, trying to come to a conclusion about what actually transpired. You're trying to work yourself deeper and deeper into the fabric of reality so that you can figure out what's out there. And it's not as though tool A is acceptable in this kind of endeavor and tool B is not. When you're trying to figure things out, you use everything at your disposal. Because what's the goal? And this is this endless confusion. I hear it, by the way, in various comments here in this festival. The documentarians are truth tellers. I would put it differently. The documentarians are in search of truth. They're looking for truth because truth matters in a true story. If there's something based on reality, you want to know whether it's true or false. After all, truth is about the relationship between language and images and the real world. So, truth. Oh, and for anybody interested, I'm publishing a book, University of Chicago Press. I might as well do a plug for my book, which comes out in January, called The Ashtray, which is about truth and reality.
And can you answer my question about wormwood and?
Uh-oh. Why did I use all of these techniques?
Yeah, why did you, if you're, I don't know, if you would describe all these techniques as helping in the search for truth, do you think that the dramatic scenes where you've scripted dialogue in Wormwood, would you describe that as a tool in the search for truth?
Yes.
And
You haven't seen Wormwood yet, but Wormwood is a story about an Army biological warfare scientist who either was thrown out or fell out or jumped out, you pick the verb, of a window at the Statler overlooking the old Penn Station on 7th Avenue and went 13 floors to the sidewalk below. The CIA put out a series of documents called the Colby documents. William Colby was the director of Central Intelligence at the time, and he put out this pile of papers. He was instructed to give them to the family by then President Gerald Ford. The Colby documents tell a story created by the CIA. Now, you tell me, was this story true? Was the story a cover-up? Or if it was a cover-up, what part of it was a cover-up? What part of it was true? And I became obsessed with the Colby documents. I still am. My obsessions never seem to end. They just go on and on and on. They'll kill me in the end. It's like having a worm inside of you, an unfriendly worm. Although I'm not sure they're friendly ones. And to me, it was really important to bring the Colby documents to life. I thought this much would be clear, but evidently it may not be. And in bringing those documents to life and the suspicions around them and the uncertainty of their veracity, you were bringing people deeper into the whole problem of the story of government lying in America, the nature of documents in general. Like any kind of expression in film, it's designed to make you think. And anything that makes you think, whether it's drama or reenactment or interview or archival material, and I was very lucky. I have the same kind of luck as I still haven't seen Jane. I'm going to see it as soon as possible. Forgive me. I've seen almost everything else you've done. We live at a time where people are really, really interested in repurposed media. I remember capturing the Friedmans when it came out, thinking how lucky Jarecki was to have found all of this footage, family footage of the brother, which was remarkable. It becomes the remarkable aspect of the film. And there have been all kinds of films that have rediscovered, repurposed material from the past. The National Geographic, Brett can speak to this a lot better than I can, but all of this material of Jane Goodall that sat in a vault somewhere and was never used. And I was fortunate in Wormwood. Frank Olson, the scientist who went out the window, was an amateur photographer. And he took all of these straight 8 movies of his family. And we got the negative, and we transferred it to 5K or whatever. And they were extraordinarily beautiful. They were just, and maybe I didn't use them in the right way. I like to see sprocket holes. And I like to see, left to right, and I like collage. I like cutting them up, montage, blah, 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 blah. But all of that is grist for the mill. It's not to say, oh, no, I don't like that. Does it serve the interests of the movie? Does it tell you something that otherwise you would not be able to grasp or understand? And my argument would be all of that style for the story is in service of the story. Good Lord, I'm lecturing you.
Well, we're almost out of time, but Jada, I began with you. Let me end with you. Now that you've made this film, Ketty, that's been so successful, what does it give you the appetite to do next?
I'm not taking anything for granted. I'm not assuming that anything else is going to be easy to do to get off the ground. So I'm just sort of starting from scratch. But it gives me hope that...
You know that dogs in Budapest are already taken care of.
Exactly.
It's going to be great, by the way.
There was initially the idea to do this as the first of a series. But it was dogs in Moscow, not in Budapest. But let's see if that ever happens. But
I'll watch it.
Thank you. Cool. Yeah, so I actually have a narrative that was waiting in line, and another documentary that they both kind of overlap thematically in a certain way. So it's going to be very interesting. But right now it's a lot of fun to research both at the same time, but execute them in very different ways. But what gives me hope with the success of Kitty is, because we had a really rough road with Kitty. It was rejected from all the big festivals at first. We were not picked up by any sales agent. We never ended up having a sales agent. And it took it showing at a festival where the general audience, cinema-going audience also attends. And as a result, there was such big response to it that we were able to get a US distribution with Oscilloscope Labs, which who saw the vision for the film and the potential for it theatrically, because it was providing an opportunity for people to get together in a cinema and celebrate something that they love. And, you know, I was unashamedly drawing people in with cats, but really, cats were the great flavoring of the cough syrup. And hopefully, you know, like people coming out of it, or people in Alabama seeing the film and saying that they cared about this guy who was feeding these cats, and he's Muslim, and they never thought a Turk would, or a Muslim would be that nice to animals. I mean, that in itself was satisfying for me. But it gives you hope that you can try to do something differently, and it's a risk, but you know, it can pay off, and you just got to stick to your vision, I guess.
Well, all these films are a delight to see on the big screen.
Can I ask Brett a question?
Yeah.
What was it like seeing this archival material of Jane Goodall for the first time? How did you become aware of it? How did you see it?
Well, National Geographic had found it, and they called me up and mentioned that they had this stuff. And when I put it on for the first time, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And that there was 140 hours of it, but it was both from a scientific standpoint, from what was Hugo documented something that had never happened in the history of evolution, would never happen again. How he photographed it was fascinating to me, and then the challenge became how to take something that talked about repurposing, something that was shot for a very different type of documentary, you know, a scientific 1963 documentary aesthetic, and appropriate that to create an immersive experience in 2017. So, but you know, I just want to touch on one thing, Tom, real quick, is alluding to what Errol's previous comments. With this archival footage and repurposing it and finding it, someone said to me, "Is your Jane film the definitive film on Jane?" I said, "Absolutely not. It may be the definitive film of this moment of Jane Goodall." But film is organic. This is why truth is so elusive, because whatever truth existed in 1963 is a different thing today. And so what I've seeked out and found in that footage is very much my narrative about what about now, not about 1963. And so I'm very acutely aware that when we're making films, they're very much a reflection of us and the time we're living in. If everyone in this room did a portrait of Benjamin Franklin right now, none of them are about Benjamin Franklin, they're about yourselves. Errol's movies are always about him. And I don't mean that in any way other than there's no way not to. As artists, our work is a reflection of us. And so the part of what I enjoy is you go on these journeys and we learn about ourselves through these other people. And the choosing the style and all that stuff is I think, is part of the fun, the game, the jigsaw puzzle of what we do. But at the end of the day, I think ultimately they all become these kind of amazing growing experiences.